Welcome to Inside Events, an international podcast focused on contemporary issues in events and festivals. This week, I'm joined by Dr. Richard Shipway, who's going to be talking a little bit about crisis and disaster management in the context of events. Welcome, Richard. In terms of who you are, what your role is, what organisation you work for, and why are you interested in disaster and crisis management in events? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
No worries. All right. Firstly, thanks for the invite, Mike, to talk about something. I think really, I'm an associate professor in sport event management at Bournemouth University, currently in the Department of Sport and Event Management. So my interests stem basically from sports events. I started working at Sheffield Hallam with Chris Grattan and Simon Shibley 20 odd years ago, and gradually moved and stayed in the events area, looking at impacts and legacies, all the sort of stuff which volunteering, sport ethnography, distance running, all the range of areas, and sort of moved across to touch on crisis and disaster management, because we have at Bournemouth University, we have a research centre for disaster management. We're doing some fantastic industry-related training courses in Oman, other Gulf states, Sierra Leone, Cameroon, looking at crisis and disasters. I was chatting to these guys and they're going, sport, there's so much relevance for what you're doing in the context of sport. And, even looking at Saudi at the moment, they did a great study or investigation on the Hajj, the pilgrimage, and as a major event in Saudi, and looking at how they made that safe with, following the tragic tragedy they had there a few years ago. And then so even now I'm sitting, football, sport, all contemporary issues, and they've worked in that space. And a couple of the professors, I'm chatting to them, and they're going, we could do so much in the context of events, and without stating the obvious. And I'd done some stuff in 2016, 2017 with colleagues from University of Queensland, linked to mega events. The old characters, Brent Ritchie, Gabby Walters, Monica, and others there. And I tried to put a bit of a crisis and disaster management spin on it, looking at risk perceptions. So that was at the time we had the Zika virus and all these other threats, and looking at what people thought were the perceptions of risk of travel for sport tourists. And no one ever mentioned pandemics, but there was so much links to sports events and the impact it had on residents. So, getting to my main point is, so I submitted a conference paper to an American conference in sport on crisis and disaster management. And I had one accepted on sport tourism, which was great. And I had the one on crisis and disaster booted out, and saying, we can't see the relevance of this subject area to the Sport Management Academy. And I'm like, okay, fair enough. I was still going to San Diego. It wasn't a problem. And then this was in 2019. And then 2 months after this, we all know what happened. The COVID scenario sort of kicked off. And the irony of this was that, I'm not, karma is what they say about karma, but they cancelled the conference because of a disaster, a pandemic. So I guess my point is, in the context of events, never say never, and that's kind of the message that I've taken of looking into this. So to answer your question, I'm really interested in bringing in perspectives from other areas of resilience studies, crisis and disaster management, and trying to bring them across to the event sphere. They're already in tourism with the stuff that Brent Ritchie and Gabby are doing, but it's to bring it over to the sport and events field for future discussion.
That's really good. Thanks, Richard. That was a good intro. And I think probably about half of the people that I spoke to so far have all described the event manager role as a firefighter, which in some sense kind of lends itself to the terminologies around and crisis and disaster management. It's always about firefighting. It's all about tackling issues, and whether it's small little stuff on the ground or whether it's kind of big wicked problems in these sorts of things, it's always about that. And then you think to yourself, well, right from the smaller events right down to the major events and the mega events, the protracted lead up period of time, often about in around a decade, there's always some sort of large-scale social, economic, political turbulence that happens, whether it's Brexit, whether it's recession, whether it's COVID, whether it's cost of living crisis. There's always some sort of disaster that kind of curtails the plan in some sense. But if we think about the concept of disaster and crisis management, I guess quite a lot of the students, particularly like first-year students, they might not yet necessarily have come up against this concept so far. Could you kind of break down what you might kind of mean by disaster and crisis management in a little bit more detail, Rich?
Yeah. I mean, I'll start on the point that you just made about types of size and scale of sports events. You've got community-based sports events and you've got mega sports events. You talk about the turbulence, but when people classify a sport event, be it Martin Muller or Chris Gratton or whoever, Holger Proust, there's never really any mention about resilience or managing crisis or an ability to deal with these things. And just because you're a mega event, it doesn't mean that you're any more resilient or you've got more problems. And that's kind of what we argued in the context of a paper I wrote with Lee Miles, is that the larger the event is actually the more challenging, because you've got more venues, you've got it going over a longer period of time, you've got higher media coverage. So, in terms of, you can break down sports events and say, well, the argument would be a smaller, up to 30,000 attendance on a one-day event is probably more resilient and subject to resistance to crisis or disasters than a mega event that's going off over a 4-week period, in the mega event context. But I guess going back to your point about crisis and disaster, I think there's 4 areas to look at. You can look in the context of what's a crisis. 3 areas maybe: risk, crisis management, and disaster management. And I think what Lee Miles and I try to argue is that a crisis is something which maybe affects an organisation. So I know FIFA's in crisis, or the Commonwealth Games are in crisis at the moment. Whereas a disaster is something which is you can't really mitigate against. And there's various definitions which we've got on it, and I've just got one here which I'll just read out. An unusual natural or man-made event, including an event caused by failure of technological systems which overwhelms the response capacity of human communities, groups of individuals, or natural environments, and which causes massive damage, economic loss, disruption, or loss of life. So I think a crisis is more manageable. A disaster is something which is beyond those realms. And Lee and I try to argue that a disaster is perhaps something which you have minimum control over. So like the pandemic. And I think you can break down that, and I trying to look at it through a lens of resilience, in terms of how can a sport event or an event develop a sense of resilience in terms of planning, preparing, and putting strategies in place to prevent something when it happens, and build up that. And I think for events that's quite important. And I guess on your final point there is, it's like thinking, well, what types of disasters do we have? And I think you can break it down quite simply into, well, not quite simply, but you can break it down into natural disasters and more human-linked disasters. So where are we at the moment? We're sat here, I'm talking in early August, when, as far I looked on the news 10 minutes ago, and Hawaii's on fire. Only yesterday we're evacuating people from scout camps in Korea because of heat exhaustion. Europe's burning. So in terms of you have those natural disasters, and then you have the more sort of human related ones in terms of terrorism and other threats. So I mean, I've just got some details here in terms of earthquakes, landslides, subsidence, tsunamis, volcanic activity, which would be geographic ones. And then you've got the more sort of meteorological ones: tornadoes, typhoons, hot spells, droughts, even tsunamis. The list is endless. And I think it goes back to the point when you'll probably ask me later about, why is this relevant? I think it's relevant because, these are happening on a frequent basis, week after week. Tsunamis are affecting sports events, and I think with the changing climate, we have to take these a lot more seriously and investigate them and explore in more depth both the natural and also the man-made scenarios based on sports events we've got coming up. I mean, you look at what we're looking at in a few weeks' time. We're looking at Rugby World Cups. Then we're going into Paris next year, and then moving forward on, at all sizes of scales. And you can almost see that, the climate and some of these sort of natural disasters are likely to happen. And I'm not saying it'll affect sports events, but, LA 2028, Certainly, I was there last year, and there's wildfires in the back of California where the mountain biking events might be taking place. So, who's to say? And I guess my point is never say never. And I think COVID was the best example of that in terms of the need to plan and prepare. And I'm not going to draw you on to say, well, look,
and Rich, do you?
yeah,
Yeah, go on, mate. Sorry.
no, it's just like stuff like I always go back to that film, like the San Andreas, with the Rock in, where they got the San Andreas fault. And I'm not saying that that's going to happen in LA, but we got sports events coming up, in these big places, and there's a likelihood that one will be affected. I mean, look at the Rugby World Cup with them. We're talking about natural disasters. You had Typhoon Hagibis, which literally affected the Rugby World Cup. And you look at the timetabling, 2 weeks later, they had the Suzuki Grand Prix, in terms of those areas. So, there's a lot of work to be done there to explore some of these areas about, about protecting and for events to become more resilient. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer.
Do you think that, no, it was good. It was good. In terms of whether you think that the event owners, managers, whoever are responsible for risk and assessing that and planning for it, are they doing enough in these kind of major event contexts to plan, or do you see just massive glaring holes in a lot of the plans and a lot of the contingency plans in these things?
Yeah, whose responsibility is it? Now, I'll give you a scenario. We went to the IOC and said we'd like to do some work on crisis and disaster management. And they're like, well, that's Paris's responsibility. And if you look at some of these big events, it's sort of, I'm not saying people pass the buck, but in terms of, you look at organizations like the FIFA World Cup, where you've got probably 7 or 8 different venues, even the Women's World Cup that's taking place at the moment. The stadiums are all owned by private companies. So, one will be owned by one. It doesn't mean that they've all got the same standard of security or protection against disasters. And who's to say Spurs here in the UK have the same level as Bournemouth have in other areas? So I guess you could look at FIFA World Cup in Australia at the moment, and you could probably take those 7, 8 venues and say, well, the Brisbane Suncorp Stadium is going to have a different level because it's privately owned to Sydney Football Stadium, and the lead organisations on a mega event would tend to maybe devolve responsibility for that down to the individual venues. But you need to have some sort of consistency across those, and that links into public-private ownership of venues. So we look very much at how can you develop consistency across venue resilience and deliver sort of resilience across a range of areas, because you could have major significant variations even within one tournament at the moment, which is a slight worry. And I think we had chats with the IOC about doing this, and they do this great scheme, don't they, about advanced research scheme, about where you can apply to do some research linked to that. And we tried to get disaster management or resilience linked into that, but they were only really interested in doing what they always do in terms of elite athlete performance or the areas that they look at. So I think there's still a challenge to even push this onto the radar academically, but also within the organisations. But I think there's positive sides. I mean, I'm going up next month to London to Deloitte to do a presentation to the Risk Advisory Group there on the importance of developing resilience at sports events and events more generally. So I think in answer to your question, I think they did. Yeah, it's on a back burner, but as events history repeats itself, doesn't it? If we go back to where we were in 84, 85, way before you were born, Mike, in terms of the Hillsborough disaster, the Bradford fire, Heysel, all these sort of disasters which led to positive change, but we look at COVID, it was only really as a result of COVID, which maybe forced people to deal with them more seriously or double down and become more bureaucratic anyway. So mixed signals on that moving forward in terms of the willingness and ability of organisations to deal more with resilience, I think.
That's interesting. No, thanks, Richard. That's really useful. And if we think about, I think you've intimated it there, which is that it's a field that's kind of constantly growing, kind of learning from each event, trying to kind of tighten the model in terms of crisis and disaster management going forward. Like, how has the concept evolved and practice evolved over the last kind of decade, for example, and where do you think it's gonna go in the future? What are the kind of key trends would you say that people have to look out for?
Yeah, I mean, I could probably give you 7 or 8 key trends to look at. I think what's interesting in our area is to build on sort of resilience based studies, but also to move outside of I've just put here, move outside of the into beyond just the sort of sports and tourism, and work with academics from from resilience studies from the mainstream crisis and disasters on some of the work that they've done. And we highlighted, I did a paper with Lee Miles in 2020 where we put together, it's published in Event Management, where we promoted 8 areas which would merit future development, which would provide opportunities for event-related academics to work on. And I think the first one really was linked to looking at event resilience and how venues, stadiums, arenas, and outdoor spaces really are part of the critical infrastructure. And how do we actually work towards becoming more resilient? And I mean, I think really what I'm sort of argued is the more mega a sport event might be, the more complexity it's got to it. At the moment it's not a mega event, but we've got the UCI cycling events in Glasgow taking place this week, and you've got, if you think about a mega event like the Olympics, the velodrome is part of a critical infrastructure. If something happens to that, you're stuffed, aren't you? If something happens to the WADA drug testing things, you've got major problems there. So also, you need to look as well in terms of venues about which are used for different things. Like you might have a sporting venue which is used for other forms of events, like pop concerts. Like last night, I think Coldplay were playing in Gothenburg, and at the weekend probably have a football match going on there. So you've got multiple uses in multiple times. So there's real scope from the wider events community to look at these venues about how resilient they are. Even like a venue like we know about the Commonwealth Games in Manchester in 2002, where the MEN Arena was redeveloped for that. So what do you have there now? You had Peter Kay playing his concerts a few years ago. Then you have the boxing events, etc., etc. And then in 2016, you have the Ariana Grande concert, which was subject to a terrorist attack. So you've got multiple venues used for multiple things in different contexts, which provides real opportunities to explore the resilience. Because I think in terms of the Ariana Grande, I might be wrong, but the week after that concert, the tragedy there was a sports event due to take place. I think it was a boxing event that was taking place. So, I think there's a real sort of area to look at there. I think other areas to look at in terms of risk perceptions about people who are traveling, what are their perceptions of risk traveling to destinations and venues? Even from a host nation's perspective, I mean, India had huge problems, didn't they? Unfortunately, with the Commonwealth Games, with I think they had a bridge collapse the day before. So there was a perception of nations, and even in the wake of Hurricane Katrina in the US, when the Superdome in New Orleans was used as a venue of last resort, you have issues where tourism destinations, when they have a terrorist or a natural disaster incident, it can affect their how people perceive them. So there's a lot of stuff linked to risk perceptions as well. I think the big one for the events community is probably issues linked to crowd management and crowd control and how that can be monitored. I mean, I'm no expert on the wider events, but there's a lot of work been done in the sports context on crowd identity and tribal allegiance and how crowds can manage disaster and crisis. Well, disasters. I think there's been a lot of work coming out of University of Sussex through John Jury and Clifford Stott, who've done a lot of work on crowd movement and crowd behaviour, and that can be applied in the events context, kind of in terms of the Astro World, or what was the Travis Scott incident a few years ago, and even go back to the Love Festival in Germany, where you have issues of crowd control and crowd management and issues there. So in the broader events context, a lot of these incidents can be explored in a lot more depth. And I think I've alluded to it already when I talked to you earlier about that link between public and private partnership of who actually owns the venues where these events are taking place, and how do we deliver that sort of continuity. So I'd probably advocate looking closely outside of this sport, event, tourism, leisure domains, and drawing from the expertise and studies that have been done in the mainstream crisis and disaster management literature, looking at it through the lens of resilience in terms of how can you plan, how can you prepare for these events, and how can you prevent these disasters in an events context. So I forget what your initial question was about moving forward and what areas
where it's come from, where it's gone, but it's lots of future trends there. And to be honest, like we're out of time, but it's been really interesting to know how kind of obviously kind of multi-dimensional the idea is, how kind of far-reaching it is, and the ton of stakeholders that need to be aware and take responsibility for all these things. Because even now you see, maybe not in the UK as much, but in kind of developing nations that are getting used to hosting major sport events, like there's still venue crushes happening. There's still fires in venues happening. There's still basic stuff happening that are still not being tackled. So it'll be interesting to see how all this evolves when the Middle East, the Gulf states, as you mentioned, a couple of them, and other emerging destinations get more into the kind of the major event scene and managing more major events. Really, it'll be interesting to see kind of how a lot of the principles that we've learned over the last years will be applied there. But
you've only got to look at Indonesia, haven't you? Last year where they had that stampede there at the football event, and these are regularly occurring events. Cameroon and some of the football incidents. They build venues in the foothills of volcanoes, and sports events in earthquake zones, and so there's. And I guess the challenge has been, with some of these developing nations where their priority is not resilience, is not crisis and disaster management. It's just build the venues, organize the event. It's a bit like with legacy planning, isn't it? Legacy planning, no one puts a budget aside for legacy. It's just build the thing and get it done. But you need to almost build in this disaster and management to be a fundamental part. But if you're an event organizer, it's not high on your radar. It's just, it's build the things and run the event, isn't it, to a certain extent? So it needs to be more high profile. So it'll only happen when you have more of these incidents, unfortunately, because history repeats itself, Mike, unfortunately. And it will continue to be in the sports.
It's so true. And it's just it's just a case of kind of putting the necessary budget aside as well to plan these things and contingency plan. And that comes at a time when particularly large scale events, their budgets are being kind of slashed as much as possible to not be a public drain on funding. So it's going to be quite interesting to see where the budget goes and whether it will be stripped from like kind of peripheral. It's not peripheral, but peripheral activities like risk and contingency planning. But right, I'm going to have to kind of wrap it up there, Richard. Just because I've got a kind of
I was just the final point I was going to say is you talk about budget, but you might not even. Nations are now pulling out of hosting these events, aren't they? So you might not even get to that stage. We talk about the Commonwealth Games and future events. So the budgets aren't there to even host the events in the first place. So where does disaster management and resilience fit in the bigger scheme if you're not even going to bid for these events? But, anyway, that's just another observation. But I could rant for 8 hours, Mike, but I won't.
That's a really good point. No. Seriously, this is a complicated idea, and we'll definitely get you on next time to maybe talk about some of the more specific bits of it, and maybe just kind of interrogate the all the different facets of it over the next kind of couple of years. It'd be good to do a kind of follow up, Rich.
Okay, mate.
So thanks for coming on Inside Events, and I know that I suggested to suggest a couple of further readings and resources that people might think about, but I'll give you an email and we'll add those on to the bottom of the podcast so people, if they're interested, can follow up some of the papers that you've done, and also kind of the vast body of work actually that's in this area.
It's a huge area of exploitation within the events field, I think, really to explore in more depth. So welcome contributions from colleagues and happy to discuss further if required.